In the quiet darkness of Hillview, North Carolina, the urgent crackle of a police radio awakens Officer Rachel Carter with a distressing call. A black infant has been abandoned alone in a house on Willow Drive. Arriving at the scene, Rachel finds the house not only physically dilapidated but also deeply reflective of the societal wounds of neglect. Inside, she discovers the lone black baby, frail and crying in a cold crib. This situation thrusts Rachel into an immediate crisis, demanding swift action. It also starkly highlights the deep-seated issues of racial discrimination and social injustice that Hillview, and indeed broader society, must confront. The faint, insistent chatter of the police radio broke through the monotonous hum of Officer Rachel Carter's evening patrol. She had just turned onto a shadowy stretch of Pinehurst Street in Hillview, North Carolina, when the dispatcher's voice crackled to life. Possible child endangerment reported, infant alone at 1729 Willow Drive. Caller states no guardian on site. Respond immediately. Rachel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as her heartbeat quickened. Willow Drive wasn't exactly known for its charm. Rows of aging houses with peeling paint, sagging porches, and a reputation that spoke of years of broken promises and systemic neglect. She activated her lights and sirens, her cruiser slicing through the quiet streets, and turned into the driveway of a dilapidated duplex. The structure loomed, its broken shutters barely clinging to the windows, graffiti tagging the sides like scars. The porch light flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. Rachel stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on gravel as she approached the open door. It creaked slightly in the wind, revealing a dim and eerily silent interior. The air carried a mix of mildew and abandonment. "Hillview Police," Rachel called, her voice firm as it echoed into the stillness. "Is anyone home?" No response. She pushed the door further, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam swept over upturned furniture and piles of discarded clothes. Then she heard it. A faint, plaintive cry, weak but persistent, coming from somewhere in the back of the house. Her pulse quickened as she followed the sound, stepping carefully over debris scattered across the floor. The crying grew louder as she approached a partially closed door. Pushing it open, Rachel froze. The room was stark and cold, with peeling wallpaper and a single crib shoved into the corner. Inside, a tiny baby, no older than a few months, lay wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his cries hoarse and his frail body trembling. A nearly empty bottle sat nearby, its contents long dried and crusted. The smell of neglect was overwhelming. Rachel's chest tightened as she moved closer. "Hey there," she whispered softly, reaching out to gently lift the baby into her arms. He was so light, almost as if he weighed nothing at all. His tiny fists clenched and unclenched, his cries punctuated by shallow, rasping breaths. Pressing her radio to her lips, Rachel spoke urgently. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I have an infant in critical condition at 1729 Willow Drive requesting EMS immediately." She rocked the baby gently, trying to soothe him as she waited. Her mind raced. What could have led to this? How long had this child been left alone? The questions came fast and furious, each one stoking the fire of anger and sorrow burning inside her. The baby's cries began to soften, fading into exhausted whimpers as he snuggled closer to Rachel's chest. His frailty was palpable, his tiny frame trembling in her arms. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for anything that might help. A can of formula, another bottle, something. But all she found were piles of dirty laundry and scattered garbage, fragments of a life abandoned. Her gaze returned to the baby. His lips moved faintly, a reflexive searching motion that made her stomach twist. Then it hit her. Rachel's youngest daughter, Emma, was just 5 months old. She was still breastfeeding and knew she had the ability to provide this child with what he needed most right now: nourishment. The thought felt instinctive yet unorthodox, and she hesitated. Was this overstepping? Would it be seen as unprofessional? But then the baby let out the faintest whimper, his desperation cutting through her doubt. This wasn't about protocol. It was about survival. "This is about saving a life," she murmured under her breath. Taking a deep breath, Rachel shifted the baby to a more comfortable position and unbuttoned her uniform shirt. The baby fussed slightly as she adjusted him, but the moment he latched on, the transformation was immediate. His tiny body relaxed, the tension melting away as his breathing steadied. The room fell into an almost reverent silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of his suckling. Rachel felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat. She had fed her own children countless times, but this moment felt different. It was raw and primal, a connection that transcended the barriers of the situation. This wasn't just nourishment. It was survival in its purest form. Minutes passed, and the baby's breaths grew deeper, steadier. Rachel gently rocked him, her mind churning with questions. What kind of life had this child known? Where was his family? How could anyone leave him in this state? The thought of someone abandoning such a fragile, innocent life filled her with a protective determination she hadn't felt in years. The distant wail of sirens broke through her thoughts, signaling the arrival of the ambulance. Rachel quickly adjusted her uniform, cradling the baby securely as she rose to meet the paramedics. When they entered the house, she gave them a quick rundown of the situation. "This little guy's in bad shape," she explained, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "He needs care right away. I did what I could to stabilize him." One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes, gently took the baby from Rachel's arms. "You did good," she said softly, glancing at Rachel with a knowing look. As the paramedics worked swiftly to prepare the baby for transport, Rachel stood back, her hands on her hips as she watched relief washed over her, knowing he was in capable hands, but a lingering ache settled in her chest. She had responded to countless calls in her career, many of them heart-wrenching, but something about this one felt different, personal. When the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Rachel remained standing in the driveway, the weight of the moment settling over her. She looked back at the rundown duplex, its silence now deafening. A part of her felt she couldn't just walk away from this. This wasn't just another call. This was the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. As she climbed back into her cruiser and prepared to file her report, Rachel glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. There was a fire in her eyes, a newfound resolve. This child had been left to fend for himself, but now he wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the paramedics carefully secured the infant in the ambulance, Officer Rachel Carter's voice was steady but laced with urgency. "We need to get him to the hospital right away," she said. "He's severely malnourished, but he's taken some milk that should help stabilize him for now." One of the paramedics, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, paused to look at her. There was a quiet respect in his expression as he said, "You did the right thing, Officer Carter. You may have just saved his life." Rachel nodded, her throat tight as she stepped back to give them room. Watching the paramedics close the ambulance doors, she caught one last glimpse of the baby, his tiny form almost swallowed by the soft blanket. Her chest ached as the vehicle sped off into the night, lights flashing against the darkened street. She stood there for a moment, frozen by the magnitude of what had just happened. A deep sense of helplessness washed over her. What more could she do for him? The system would take over now, paperwork, caseworkers, and red tape. Yet, as she climbed into her cruiser, Rachel knew this wasn't the end. That single act of compassion had forged a connection she couldn't shake. She couldn't just walk away. Her thoughts churned as she drove back to the station. Who was this baby? What circumstances had led to his abandonment? And most importantly, how could she ensure he would never face such neglect again? The answers eluded her. But one thing was clear, her life had shifted in a way she didn't yet fully understand. News of the incident spread faster than Rachel anticipated. By the time she arrived at the precinct, the story had already become the topic of conversation. A fellow officer greeted her with a wide grin. "You're a hero," he said as she walked in, clapping her on the shoulder. Others nodded in agreement, their admiration evident. Rachel offered polite smiles and murmured thank yous, but inside she felt anything but heroic. All she could think about was Jonah, the name she'd already started to use for the baby in her mind, and his fragile body trembling in her arms. She couldn't shake the image of him lying alone in that cold, empty room. The praise from her colleagues felt misplaced. What mattered wasn't her actions, but the fact that Jonah had been saved. Yet, the gnawing question remained. What would happen to him next? The following morning, Rachel's concern drew her to the pediatric ward before her shift. She entered the hospital with a purpose, her steps brisk but her heart heavy with apprehension. A nurse at the front desk recognized her immediately. "You're here about the baby," the nurse said warmly, motioning her toward the ward. "He's doing better. Let me take you to see him." Rachel followed, her pulse quickening as they navigated the corridors. When they reached the ward, Nurse Carla, a seasoned caregiver with a soothing presence, greeted her. "Good morning, Officer Carter," Carla said with a reassuring smile. "Your little guy is holding on. We've been calling him Jonah for now. He's responding well to care, but he's got a long way to go." Rachel let out a slow breath, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Can I see him?" Carla nodded and led her to a small crib tucked into a corner of the room. Jonah lay swaddled in a soft blue blanket, his tiny face far more peaceful than it had been the night before. Rachel's eyes scanned his delicate features, noting how his shallow breathing had grown steadier. Though his frailty was still painfully evident, there was a hint of strength returning to him. She reached out, brushing a gentle finger along his hand. His tiny fingers twitched in response, and a lump rose in her throat. "Hey there, little guy," she whispered. "You've got a whole team rooting for you now." Carla stood nearby, her voice kind but firm. "He's stable for now, but his malnutrition has taken a toll. It's going to take time, and we'll need to run more tests to fully understand his condition." Rachel nodded, her protective instincts kicking in. "What happens to him next? Does he stay here?" "For the immediate future, yes," Carla replied. "But child services will be involved soon to determine his long-term care. It's likely he'll go into foster care unless his family is found." The mention of foster care sent a pang through Rachel's chest. She'd seen enough cases to know that the system, while often well-intentioned, wasn't always perfect. The thought of Jonah bouncing between strangers, possibly facing more neglect or indifference, made her stomach turn. "Do we know anything about his parents?" Rachel asked, her voice low. Carla shook her head. "Not yet." The police report said there were no clues at the scene. "It's heartbreaking, but we'll do everything we can for him." Rachel lingered by the crib, her thoughts racing. Jonah had already been let down by the people meant to protect him. She couldn't stand the idea of him slipping through the cracks again. A fierce resolve settled over her. She didn't know what her role in his life would be, but she was determined to ensure he had a future filled with care and stability. As she left the hospital, Rachel's mind was already spinning with plans. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she wasn't done fighting for Jonah. Not by a long shot, Rachel reached out and gently brushed her fingers against Jonah's tiny hand. His fragile fingers twitched in response, and her heart swelled with a mix of hope and determination. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice soft but resolute. As the days passed, Rachel's actions began to ripple through Hillview. Local news outlets picked up the story, focusing on her unconventional decision to nurse Jonah in a moment of desperation and how it had saved his life. At first, Rachel was uneasy with the attention. She didn't see her actions as extraordinary. To her, it was simply what the moment required. But then something unexpected began to happen. Residents from all corners of the community started showing up at the hospital, arms laden with donations, diapers, formula, baby clothes, toys. Some inquired about how they could help foster or adopt children in need. Jonah's story had struck a chord, awakening a collective sense of responsibility and compassion within the town. One afternoon, as Rachel left the hospital, a woman approached her, holding a baby carrier. She introduced herself as Loretta, a retired teacher with decades of experience fostering children. "Officer Carter," Loretta began, her voice trembling with emotion. "What you did for that baby reminded me why I started fostering all those years ago. It's easy to get jaded, to lose hope, but you showed us all that one act of love can make all the difference." Rachel felt a warmth rise in her chest. An emotion she hadn't expected. Loretta's words stayed with her as she continued her shifts. Everywhere she went, people stopped to thank her or share how Jonah's story had inspired them to step forward and help vulnerable children in their own ways. Not all responses were supportive. Social media, which had amplified the story, also brought its share of criticism. Some questioned her decision to breastfeed Jonah, twisting the narrative into something uncomfortable. Why would she do that for a baby that wasn't hers? One comment read, "Others used the situation to stir racial tension, turning a moment of compassion into a platform for division." Rachel tried to focus on the positive, on the outpouring of kindness and the lives Jonah's story had already touched. But the negativity weighed on her at times, especially when she scrolled through thoughtless comments. She wasn't naive. She knew the world had its share of prejudice and misunderstanding. Yet, she also knew that none of it mattered to Jonah. He didn't care about her skin color or the controversy surrounding their story. All he knew was that she had been there for him when no one else was. As the weeks passed, the community's response grew into something larger than Rachel could have imagined. Local churches organized fundraisers to support abandoned and neglected children. Small businesses donated supplies to foster programs. Even the simplest acts, delivering a hot meal to a foster family or knitting a blanket for a child in need, added to the collective wave of goodwill. Jonah's story had sparked a transformation in Hillview. At the center of it all was Rachel, grappling with the weight of her newfound role. She wasn't used to being the focus of so much attention and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. All she had wanted was to save a baby who had been left behind. Now, she found herself at the heart of a movement. 2 weeks after the call that had changed her life, Rachel received an unexpected message from the hospital. The text was brief but carried a gravity she wasn't prepared for. "Family has come forward for Jonah. They'd like to meet with you." Later that day, Rachel arrived at the hospital, her emotions a mix of relief and apprehension. She was ushered into a small, quiet meeting room where a young woman sat with her hands clasped tightly together. She looked up as Rachel entered, her eyes red from crying. "I'm Annika," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I'm Jonah's aunt." Rachel nodded, sitting across from her. "I'm Officer Carter," she said gently. "It's good to meet you." Annika took a shaky breath. I didn't know," she began, her voice breaking. "I didn't know he was in that situation." Rachel stayed silent, letting her continue. "My sister, Tasha, Jonah's mom, she's been struggling for years," Annika explained, tears streaming down her face. "She got caught up in things she couldn't handle, and I've been trying to reach her, but—" Her words faltered, her guilt and pain palpable. Rachel leaned forward, her tone soft but steady. "Go on." Annika wiped her tears, her hands shaking. "Our family has been fractured for so long. Everyone's been dealing with their own struggles, and Jonah, he slipped through the cracks. I should have been there for him. I should have done more." Rachel reached across the table, her voice firm yet compassionate. It's not too late. Annika Jonah needs people who love him, people who will fight for him. That starts with you. Annika nodded, her tears flowing freely now. I want to make it right. I want to bring him home. Rachel felt a flicker of hope. Then let's make sure Jonah gets what he deserves, a family that will protect and cherish him. When Rachel finally left the hospital that day, the weight she had been carrying felt lighter. Jonah's future wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. His story, which had begun in heartbreak, was beginning to take a new shape. As she stepped out into the fading light, Rachel reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 weeks. Jonah had become more than a call on her police radio or a fragile infant in her arms. He had become a symbol of resilience and the power of compassion, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance to rewrite the story. Rachel sat in the small meeting room at the hospital, facing Annika, Jonah's aunt. The young woman's voice trembled as she spoke, her emotions raw and unguarded. I want to take him in, Annika said, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I've already started working with social services. I wanted to thank you for what you did. You saved him. You gave him a chance. Rachel felt a mix of emotions, her heart caught between relief and sadness. Over the past weeks, she had visited Jonah almost daily, watching him grow stronger, his giggles and bright eyes a testament to his resilience. Letting go of that bond wasn't easy, but she knew this was the best outcome, a chance for Jonah to reconnect with his family and rebuild the ties he had nearly lost. A few days later, Rachel joined the hospital staff as they introduced Annika to Jonah. The little boy, now visibly healthier, sat in a brightly colored chair, his curious eyes fixed on the new face before him. Annika knelt down, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch his cheek. He's beautiful, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Rachel stood at the edge of the room, watching the moment unfold. Her chest swelled with a bittersweet ache. She had been the bridge between Jonah's traumatic past and his hopeful future, and now it was time to let him cross. In the weeks that followed, Annika threw herself into preparing for Jonah's arrival. The community that had rallied around Jonah continued to show their support, helping Annika set up a nursery and providing everything from diapers to toys. It was a testament to how deeply Jonah's story had touched the town. But Annika wasn't the only family member who surfaced. Tasha, Jonah's mother, reached out from a rehabilitation center where she was working to rebuild her life. Though she wasn't yet ready to take Jonah back, she expressed a desperate desire to remain in his life. Rachel agreed to meet Tasha at her request. The young woman appeared thin and weary, her eyes shadowed with the weight of years of hardship. She fidgeted with her hands, struggling to find the words. I don't deserve him, Tasha admitted, tears spilling down her cheeks. But I love him. I want him to know that I want to do better. Rachel's response was firm but compassionate. It's going to take time, Tasha, and it won't be easy. But if you're serious about being in his life, it starts with staying honest with yourself and with Jonah. He needs stability, not promises. Are you ready for that? Tasha nodded, her determination flickering through her tears. I'll do whatever it takes. When Rachel visited Annika's home after Jonah had moved in, she was struck by how much love had transformed the modest 2-bedroom house. The living room was alive with vibrant signs of Jonah's presence. Brightly colored toys scattered across the floor, family photos lining the walls, and the soft hum of a lullaby drifting from his nursery. Annika greeted her at the door, her smile tired but genuine. Come on in, she said. Jonah's napping, but he should be up soon. He's been full of energy these days. Rachel stepped inside, taking in the warmth of the home. It was clear that Annika had poured her heart into making it a safe haven for Jonah. In the corner of the nursery, a small crib sat beneath a gently spinning mobile of stars and moons. "I wanted him to feel safe," Annika said, catching Rachel's gaze. "After everything he's been through, he deserves that." When Jonah woke up, his little face lit up at the sight of Rachel. He reached for her, and she couldn't resist scooping him into her arms. Holding him close, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He was thriving, surrounded by love and care, a stark contrast to the neglected baby she had found weeks ago. Annika sat beside her, watching the moment unfold. "You know, the way the community came together for Jonah, it gave me hope," she said softly. "People I didn't even know showed up to help. It's like he brought out the best in everyone." Rachel nodded, her mind drifting back to the fundraisers, the foster program volunteers, and the heartfelt conversations Jonah's story had inspired. He had become more than a baby in need. He was a catalyst for change. The day Tasha visited Annika's home for the first time, Rachel was there to offer support. The young mother's hands shook as she approached Jonah, her nervousness palpable. "Hi, baby," Tasha said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm your mommy." Jonah looked at her curiously, his wide eyes studying her face. Then, slowly, he reached out a tiny hand. Tasha let out a small, choked sob as she took it, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He'll get to know you," Annika said gently, her voice full of both understanding and resolve. "It's going to take time, but we'll figure it out together." For Rachel, witnessing the tentative reunion was a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. Months later, Rachel found herself at Jonah's first birthday party. The backyard of Annika's home was filled with laughter and the aroma of barbecue. Friends, neighbors, and community members who had supported Jonah from the beginning came together to celebrate his life and the journey they had all been a part of. Rachel watched from a distance as Jonah smashed his tiny fists into a teddy bear-shaped cake, his giggles infectious. He was surrounded by love, by people who cared for him deeply, and a family that was healing one step at a time. Before she left, Annika pulled Rachel aside. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save Jonah's life, you changed ours." Rachel smiled, her eyes misting. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "It was all of us." Driving away from the party, Rachel felt a profound sense of peace. Jonah's story, which had begun in such darkness, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of compassion and the strength of love. As she looked ahead at the road, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. There were more lives to touch, more stories to rewrite, and more sparks of hope waiting to be ignited.